It was just after midnight, around 12:30 inches the morning on the 9th of August, 2013. A man named Kyle Lawson was fast asleep in his bed next to his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas. The house was quiet, the night was still, and then suddenly, the distinct sound of a cell phone ringing cut through the silence. It was Kyle's phone. He groggily reached over, his eyes still half closed, and looked at the screen. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 6-year-old Brandon. Kyle figured it must be important to be calling this late, so he answered it. But before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through the phone, frantic and panicked. He told Kyle he needed help, right now. And then, he launched into a story that sounded completely wild. Brandon said he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this isn't some busy interstate. Highway 277 is a desolate, two-lane country road that cuts right through the vast, empty landscape of West Texas. There's not much out there. Brandon told Kyle that as he was driving, he was being chased by 3 men. He didn't say who they were, just that they were after him. And to make matters worse, his truck was on its last legs. He was about to run out of gas any second. So, what he needed Kyle to do was to grab a gas can, drive out to the highway in the middle of the night, find him, and secretly hand off the gas so he could make his escape. As Kyle listened to all this, you might think he'd be terrified for his brother. But he wasn't. In fact, his main feeling was just pure annoyance. He wasn't concerned about 3 mysterious men chasing his brother because he was almost certain those men didn't exist. He was sure his brother Brandon was just high again and he was hallucinating. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. He'd been doing really well for the last 6 months, he'd been clean, he was working hard at being a better partner to his fiancée, a woman named Ledessa, and a better father to their 4 kids. But Kyle knew something had recently changed. Just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called him for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. Instead, he tried to talk him out of it. He told Brandon, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words didn't make a difference. And based on this new crazy phone call, he was pretty sure Brandon had found what he was looking for anyway. The story about the 3 men, the frantic chase, it all sounded like a classic drug-induced paranoia episode. In fact, Kyle already knew why Brandon was even out on that highway in the first place. He had talked to his parents earlier, and they told him that Brandon had gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. The plan was for Brandon to drive over to their parents' house to cool off for a while. He was essentially in a timeout for his behavior. So the fact that he was now calling with a story about a high-speed chase just cemented Kyle's belief that his brother had relapsed and was completely spun out. Kyle knew from experience that trying to reason with Brandon in this state was pointless. If he told him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high," it would just make things worse. Brandon wouldn't believe him. So, instead of arguing, Kyle tried to just calm him down. He tried to speak in a soothing voice, tried to get him to focus, but it wasn't working. Brandon just got more and more agitated on the other end of the line. He kept talking about the 3 men, how they were gaining on him, how he was in serious trouble. Finally, Kyle just had to ask. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" As expected, Brandon immediately denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real. And he just kept begging, "Please, Kyle, you have to come help me. Bring the gas. They're going to catch me. You have to hurry." Kyle felt a wave of frustration. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. This was his brother's mess, not his. He had his own family, his own responsibilities. He shouldn't have to be babysitting his younger brother in the middle of the night. But at the same time, despite the resentment, Kyle loved his brother. And even though he truly believed there was no real danger from some imaginary men, He was worried about what Brandon might do to himself in this state. So, with a heavy sigh, he made a decision. He was going to go out there. He was going to drive down Highway 277, find Brandon, and just get him home safely. He told Brandon he was on his way and then hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving his car north on that same dark highway. His wife was in the passenger seat, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife hadn't wanted him to go out alone to deal with his brother, so she insisted they all go together. As Kyle drove, he scanned the dark road ahead. Like I said, this area is incredibly desolate. It's just wide open plains on either side of the road with some low shrubs and a few small trees scattered about. Even at night, you can see for a long, long way. There are no buildings, no city lights, nothing to block your view. He was looking for Brandon's truck, but he didn't see anything. There were no other headlights, no taillights, no vehicles at all. The road was completely empty. But he kept driving, peering out into the darkness, even checking the fields on the side of the road, just in case Brandon had swerved off and gotten stuck somewhere. That seemed like a real possibility given his state of mind. And then, finally, after driving for a while, he saw it. Up ahead in the distance, a truck was parked on the shoulder, half on the road and half off. All its lights were off. It wasn't even idling. The engine was clearly shut down. As Kyle got closer, he recognized it. It was Brandon's truck. He had found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her and their son to stay in the car. He was going to go talk to Brandon, who he assumed was sitting in his truck, waiting. In Kyle's mind, the scene was playing out exactly as he'd expected. There were no other cars, no sign of the 3 men. Just his brother, sitting alone in his truck, probably high as a kite. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go home, and they could put this whole crazy night behind them. But when Kyle walked across the road and got to the truck, he looked inside. And there was no one there. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense to Kyle. As he had been driving out to meet him, Brandon had been calling him over and over again. Every few minutes, his phone would ring, and it would be Brandon, saying things like, "Hurry up, you've got to get here. They're getting closer. Bring the gasoline." He had been desperate for Kyle to arrive. And now that Kyle was finally here, standing right next to his brother's truck, Brandon was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said anything on the phone about getting out of the truck or hiding. So where was he? What was going on? Kyle started looking around the vehicle, even checking underneath it, feeling more and more confused. And just then, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now completely fed up, answered the phone. "Brandon, where are you?" he said, his voice sharp with irritation. And Brandon's voice came back. "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not," he said. "I'm looking right at your truck. You're not here. There's no one here." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. A car was coming towards them down the highway. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. The officer was clearly slowing down, obviously planning to stop and see what was going on. And as this cop car was pulling up, Brandon's voice on the phone said something that sent a chill down Kyle's spine. He said, "Run away from that cop. Think about what that means." For Brandon to say that, he had to be watching the scene unfold. He had to be somewhere nearby, close enough to see Kyle, the truck, and the approaching police car. But where? Kyle scanned the open fields on both sides of the road again. It was basically a barren wasteland. There was nowhere to hide. There were a few scattered shrubs and some very small trees way off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was now furious and totally bewildered. What kind of game was Brandon playing? He knew exactly why Brandon wanted him to run from the police. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest on a drug charge. He was trying to protect himself, telling Kyle not to get the police involved. But Kyle was already involved. He was out here, in the middle of the night, with his wife and child, dealing with this nonsense. He was so incredibly annoyed, he was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the police officer had pulled over and parked. He got out of his car and walked over to Kyle, who was still standing by his brother's truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He explained that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker who had reported a stranded vehicle on the side of the road. He pointed to Brandon's truck and asked Kyle if it was his. Kyle knew he couldn't tell the truth. As much as he wanted to just unload everything on the deputy, that his brother was probably high on meth, hiding somewhere in the fields, and had a warrant out for his arrest, he couldn't do it. He had to protect his brother. So he told a different story. He said, "No, that's my brother's truck. He called me and said he ran out of gas. I think he must have started walking to go find some." He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove a little farther down the road to look for Brandon. He said he was sure he was fine, but he wanted to find him and give him a ride. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal agreed. He told him that was fine. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther down the highway away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's empty truck. Once he was far enough down the road that he knew the deputy couldn't see him anymore, Kyle pulled over again. He immediately started calling his brother's phone over and over and over, trying to get him to pick up. But there was no answer. At this point, Kyle had no idea what to do. His brother was out of contact, hiding somewhere in the dark, and he was stuck on the side of a highway with his tired family. They sat there for a while longer, Kyle periodically trying to call Brandon, but every call went straight to voicemail. Eventually, his 4-year-old son started crying in the back seat. It was now almost 0 inches the morning. He was tired, his wife was tired, and Kyle was just completely over it. He thought to himself, "You know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to help him. I came all the way out here. If he wants to hide in a ditch and not answer his phone, that's his choice. I'm taking my family home." And so that's exactly what he did. He turned the car around and drove back the way he came. As he passed his brother's truck, he saw it was still there. And Deputy Neal was still standing beside it, presumably waiting for the owner to return. Kyle just drove right on by, went home, and they all went to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some crazy story to explain everything. He just hoped it would be the end of it. Not long after Kyle drove off, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night. He had done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing alarming inside. But he did notice that the things a person would normally take with them if they were walking to get gas, like a wallet, keys, or a cell phone, were all missing. This seemed to support the story that Brandon had left on foot. It seemed like a simple case of a guy running out of fuel. So Neal figured he had other calls to get to. It didn't seem like an emergency. He reached into Brandon's truck, turned on the hazard lights so other drivers could see it, then he locked all the doors, got back in his own patrol car, and left. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 just to check if Brandon had come back for his truck. But he hadn't. The truck was still sitting there, right where he'd left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, Deputy Neal started to feel a bit concerned. It was one thing for the truck to be there for a few hours, but for it to still be there the next morning was strange. Even if Brandon was just walking to get gas, he should have been back by now. All sorts of scenarios started running through his head. Maybe he got hit by a car while walking in the dark. Maybe he got lost wandering in the fields. Or maybe he just decided to abandon the truck and went home some other way. Whatever the case, Neal felt he needed to follow up and make sure Brandon was actually okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up Brandon's contact information. But as soon as he walked in the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, and the story she told was very different from the one Kyle had given him the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past couple of days. On the night he disappeared, he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off. But he never made it there. And he never came back home to her either. No one had seen or heard from him since he left. Everyone had been calling and texting him, but he wasn't responding. Brandon was officially missing. After hearing this, Deputy Neal was both surprised and pretty angry. It was clear now that Brandon's brother Kyle had been holding back the night before. He had acted like everything was fine, but that was obviously a lie. So the first thing Neal did was go and speak to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full story. And it didn't take long for him to realize that they weren't trying to hide some dark secret. They were just trying to protect Brandon, and they honestly didn't realize how serious the situation had become. Now that they knew he was truly missing, they were terrified. They told Neal everything they knew about the drug use, the fight, the paranoid phone call. They begged him to go find him. And that's what Neal did. For the next 4 days, a huge search operation was launched. The search was centered around the spot on Highway 277 where Brandon's truck had been found. They had search teams on foot, canine units, and even helicopters scouring the area. Some of the equipment even had thermal cameras, which could detect body heat from the air. They covered a massive area of that flat, open Texas landscape, but they found absolutely nothing. No sign of Brandon. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing. They also interviewed all the people who owned property in the surrounding area, asking if they had seen a man walking around, or perhaps the 3 men Brandon claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon had just vanished into thin air. After 4 days of finding absolutely no clues, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete lack of any evidence of foul play, he must have fled. They decided he was not in the area because he didn't want to be found. They believed he had run away to start a new life, and searching for him out here was a waste of time. So, they called off the search. It seemed like a pretty open and shut case of a man voluntarily disappearing. That is, until Ledessa came into the station with a piece of information that would change everything. On the 13th of August, 2013, 4 days after Brandon went out subjing, right as the official search was being shut down, Ledessa walked into the Coke County Sheriff's Department. An officer sat down with her, and he could see she was extremely distraught. She told him that she had been so worried she had started digging through their shared cell phone records, looking for any clues she could find. And she found something. She pulled a piece of paper from her purse and handed it to the officer. It was a printed copy of Brandon's call log from the night he disappeared. She pointed to one specific entry. It showed that at 12:50 a.m., in between all the frantic calls he had made to his brother Kyle, Brandon had placed another call. He had called 911. Ledessa told the officer that this terrified her. She explained that Brandon was deeply afraid of the police. He would do anything to avoid them, especially with that active warrant hanging over his head. She knew he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. The only reason, she insisted, that Brandon would ever willingly call 911 is if he believed he was in truly grave, immediate danger. But then, she asked, why would he call for help and then seemingly run away from that help when it arrived? It made no sense at all. This was a complete bombshell for the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they had believed the 911 call that night came from a passing trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. That was the call that sent Deputy Neal to the scene. No one had any idea that Brandon himself had also called 911. The local 911 dispatch center was small, underfunded, and often overwhelmed. It appeared that in the confusion of that night, Brandon's call had simply slipped through the cracks and was never properly communicated to the responding officers. They had never known about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call. They immediately contacted the dispatch center and requested the audio recording. When they got it and played it in the office, they were stunned. First, Brandon's voice on the recording was not the voice of someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in absolute terror. He genuinely believed his life was on the line. And second, if you listened very, very closely to the recording, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background on Brandon's end of the line just before the call suddenly cut off. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice, breathless and panicked, said, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field." A stator just pushed guys over right here going toward Abilene on both sides. The dispatcher, clearly confused, said, "Okay, now run that by me one more time." Brandon replied, but his words were jumbled and hard to understand. It sounded like he said, "We're not talking to him. I accidentally ran into him." The dispatcher, trying to clarify, said, "Ah, you ran into him." Okay. Then Brandon said something chilling. "Got the first guy." The dispatcher then asked, "Do you need an ambulance?" Brandon quickly replied, "Yeah, no, I need the cops." The dispatcher then asked, "Okay, is anybody hurt?" But all that came back was silence. The dispatcher called out, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" But the line was dead. Suddenly, the entire case looked different. This wasn't just a guy with a drug problem running away from his life. This sounded like a possible abduction or even a murder. They didn't have a body, but that 911 call gave a terrifying amount of credibility to Brandon's story about being chased. That other voice, his talk of being in a field, of needing the cops, it all pointed to something violent. The search that had just been called off was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense, and more desperate. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured enormous resources into finding Brandon Lawson. But they found nothing. Not a single trace. He was just gone. The area around Highway 277 was searched and researched, but it yielded no clues. Eventually, with no leads to follow, Brandon's case went cold. The authorities may have moved on, but his family never did. LaDessa hired 2 different private detectives over the years. Both of them conducted their own extensive searches, not just around the highway, but all across the state, following up on any potential sightings or tips. But they too came up with nothing. As the years went by, the story of Brandon's disappearance began to spread. It was featured on television shows and podcasts, and it captured the public's imagination. People came up with all sorts of theories. Maybe Brandon really was just hallucinating, wandered off into the vast Texas wilderness, and fell victim to the elements or wild animals. Or maybe his story was true. Maybe those 3 men were real, and they caught up to him that night and did something terrible. Perhaps that other voice on the 911 call belonged to one of his attackers. Or maybe, just maybe, the original police theory was right, and he had successfully fled the area and started a new life under a new name. For 9 long years, there were only questions. And then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers went back out to that same stretch of Highway 277. In a field that had been searched hundreds of times before, they made a discovery that would finally break the case wide open. This small team of volunteers was methodically combing through a field right off the side of the highway, not far from where Brandon's truck had been abandoned. Again, this was an area that had been searched by professionals, by dogs, by helicopters, by hundreds of people over the years. But on this day, as they were walking through the low grass and brush, they saw something. It was an old, tattered pair of shorts, and nearby they found pieces of 2 white sneakers. They knew immediately this could be significant, so they called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived quickly, secured the area, and began their own careful search. And not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered something else. It was a fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent off for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. The skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally provide some answers, some closure for his family. But in a strange way, it only made the mystery deeper and more baffling. The location where his remains were found was the biggest problem. It was right there, near his truck, in the very heart of the original search area. An area that had been meticulously combed time and time again. Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open field in West Texas. There's nothing but grass, short cactus plants, and a few scattered trees. It's an easy place to search. It seems almost impossible that hundreds of trained searchers with dogs and thermal imaging could have missed a body or even just skeletal remains in such an open space. And yet, for 9 years, that's exactly what happened. His skull fragment, his shorts, and his shoes were just not found. It defied all logic. So, this leaves us with two profoundly unsettling possibilities. The first option is that every single search effort over the course of nearly a decade was a failure. That despite the massive manpower, the K-9 units, the helicopters with thermal cameras, and the hundreds of volunteers who walked that ground, they all simply missed him. They all somehow overlooked the body of a grown man who was wearing bright white shoes, lying in a relatively barren field where you can see for miles. That is option one. The second option is that he wasn't there to be found. That during all of those searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if you accept that possibility, it raises even more questions. Where was he? If he was killed, where did it happen? And most disturbing of all, if he was somewhere else, how did a piece of his skull and his clothing end up back in that field right at the center of the search area 9 years later? Was it a coincidence that a small group of volunteers just happened to find it? Or were his remains placed there recently, deliberately, for someone to find? And if so, who would do that and why? We may finally know where Brandon Lawson's journey ended, but the question of how he got there and who was with him in his final moments remains a haunting mystery, lost somewhere out on that long, dark Texas highway. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! One afternoon in February of 2007, a man walked nervously across an icy parking lot. He was heading towards the front door of a police station in Merrillville, Indiana. This man had just been arrested, and he was being brought in for processing. But he had this hope, a strong belief, really, that he wouldn't be there for long. He thought he'd be allowed to leave almost immediately. And that's because he had a piece of information, a huge piece of information, about a murder case that had been cold for 4 years. He was planning to trade this information for his own freedom. And even though he was a little nervous it might not work, deep down, he was pretty confident it would. Because this wasn't just some small tip he was offering. This was a bombshell that would blow the whole case wide open. On the afternoon of the 17th of April, 2003, a 33-year-old man named John Parker Jr. was sitting at his desk. He was in his office at J&J Parker Industries, right there in Merrillville, Indiana. He was trying to get through a stack of paperwork, and he was really hoping for just a few minutes of uninterrupted quiet time to finish it. In John's world, finding a few quiet minutes was a rare thing. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company. They trained people on how to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums might not sound very glamorous, but John's company was incredibly successful, and running it was a massive amount of work. He was constantly on his feet, managing a team of about 25 employees, solving one problem after another. He almost never got a quiet moment to sit down and do things like paperwork. And even though John would sometimes complain about how busy he was, the truth is, he loved it. He had always been a hard worker, a real go-getter. He actually started out in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman. And back then, everyone told him there was no real money to be made in vacuums. But John was determined to prove them wrong, and he did. He was so good at sales, so naturally talented, that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now, just a few years later, he had his own company that taught other people how to be just as successful as he was. But right now, as John was trying to focus on his paperwork, his desk phone started ringing. He let out a little sigh and picked it up. It was his wife, Judy. She was calling to remind him about their daughter's homework. She'd left it in his office a couple of days ago, and Judy asked him if he could please remember to bring it home with him that night. John was about to tell her that this was the second time she had reminded him about the homework today, but he caught himself. He decided not to say anything. Because right now, things between them were actually pretty good. Their relationship was on solid ground, and he didn't want to do anything to mess that up. John and Judy had been married for 10 years. She wasn't just his partner in life, she was his partner in business, too. Judy was the second J in J&J Parker Industries. Together, they were raising 4 kids. To the outside world, John and Judy looked like the perfect power couple. They were happy, successful, and had a beautiful family. But the reality was a lot more complicated than that. About a year before this, Judy had had an affair. And at the time, John had been completely devastated. But he really loved his family, and he wanted to give their marriage another chance. They had been living in Michigan when the affair happened, and they both agreed that moving the business to Merrillville, Indiana, which was where John was originally from, would be a good way to get a fresh start. And so far, it seemed like they had made the right decision. The business was thriving, things were looking up for them financially, and most importantly, John and Judy were getting along again. They were trying to rebuild their trust. So, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for the reminder about the homework, he just said, sure. He told her he'd grab it and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up the phone with Judy, there was a knock on his office door. His office manager, a man named Barry Jones, came charging in holding a bunch of files. Barry dropped them right on John's desk and said he was sorry to interrupt, but he needed a signature right away. It was the final termination paperwork for an employee John had recently fired. The employee's name was Derek Hall. About a week earlier, John had made the tough decision to let Derek go. It wasn't anything personal against Derek, he just wasn't a good fit for the company. He couldn't seem to keep up with the sales quotas, and John had very high standards for his employees. That's how he'd become a millionaire in the first place, by setting a high bar and meeting it. But Derek hadn't taken the firing well. He seemed to think it was John's fault, that John had a personal vendetta against him. Derek had actually shown up at the J&J office and made a big scene in the parking lot. He was yelling that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. John had tried to calm the situation down, to talk to Derek rationally, but Derek had gotten physical and actually attacked him. It got so bad that the police had to be called to separate them before it got any uglier. In the end, John had just paid Derek the money he was demanding. He didn't want the drama. He just wanted the whole thing to be over with. And that's why, right now, he was quickly scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry. He was hoping that this would be the absolute last time he would ever have to see or even think about Derek Hall again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home. His house was only about a 15-minute drive from the office. When he got inside, he heard Judy call down from upstairs. She said she'd be ready for their date night soon. He yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. You see, just a little over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office. The two of them had gone to a buffet together for a late lunch. So, John wasn't really hungry at all anymore. But he knew that this dinner with Judy was more about spending time together and reconnecting than it was about the food. So, he wasn't going to say anything about his earlier meal. John walked into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. There was his one 7-year-old daughter, Christina, her one 5-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The 2 older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight, so he and Judy could have their night out. But when John tried to start a conversation with them, both Christina and Daniel just gave him the cold shoulder. They barely even looked at him. Now, for any other parent, this might just seem like typical teenage behavior. But for John, it felt more complicated than that. Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their lives since they were very young, and he had always considered himself to be their real dad. He had tried so hard to be involved. He coached Daniel's baseball team, he went to all the school concerts, he never missed a parent-teacher conference. But recently, his relationship with both of them had changed. It had become strained. And frankly, both kids had started acting out a lot more. Christina was repeatedly throwing parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone. And Daniel was becoming more and more combative. He was hanging out with a group of friends who seemed to be constantly in trouble with the law. And this was creating a lot of conflict in the house, specifically between them and John. Because John was the one who tried to enforce the rules and discipline them. Judy, on the other hand, always seemed to play the good cop, letting things slide. But John knew that trying to force a conversation with them right now wouldn't get him anywhere. So he just sat down quietly, and they all watched TV in silence until Judy came downstairs and announced she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left the restaurant. They got in their car and started driving back towards John's office at J&J Parker Industries. The office was located in an office park in a pretty secluded area. The two of them had had a really nice dinner. They had talked and seemed to be connecting. But during the meal, Christina had called. She wanted to know where that homework was, the homework John was supposed to bring home. And John, feeling a wave of embarrassment, suddenly realized that despite all of Judy's reminders, the same ones he was getting annoyed by earlier, he had completely forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, making a stop to pick it up on their way home. John pulled the car into the parking lot, and they both got out. When they walked into the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there, hard at work. John wasn't too surprised by this. Things had been really busy lately. They were planning new training seminars and trying to find a new hire to replace Derek. And Barry was the one in charge of keeping everything organized. John didn't feel too bad about Barry putting in all these extra hours. It was his job, after all, and the whole company relied on him to make sure nothing important slipped through the cracks. So, when Barry mentioned to John that he was actually thinking about heading home soon, John told him no. At that same moment, John saw Judy grab the homework off his desk. She gave a little wave and then hustled back out to the car. As he watched her go, John turned back to Barry and told him he was sorry, but he really needed him to stay and finish what he was working on. It was important. But then, to try and soften the blow of this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had a basically untouched, full meal in a to-go box since he hadn't been hungry. Barry kind of grumbled about having to stay, but he said he would take the food if John was offering. So John nodded and went back outside to the car to get it for him. Moments later, John was back at the car where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened the back door and picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked over her shoulder at him, he told her he was just going to run the food back inside to Barry. She just shrugged and said, "Fine," then turned back around to face the front. But right at that exact moment, as John was closing the car door, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the concrete coming up right behind him. But before he even had a chance to turn around and see who it was, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too. It was immediately followed by a second one. Her instincts took over and she ducked down in her seat. Then she looked back towards John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. Before she could even process what was happening, before she could scream or move, she saw a person. They were dressed in dark clothes and wearing a mask. The person crouched over John's body for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car, running towards the main road and disappearing into the darkness. Judy scrambled out of the car and ran to John's side, screaming his name. But he just lay there, on the cold pavement, completely still. And then she saw it. A huge pool of dark blood was spreading out from underneath his head. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Judy ran back to the office door and screamed at the top of her lungs for Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was a swarm of flashing blue and red lights. It was overrun with police officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was a man named Detective Donald Toth. He'd been with the Maryville Police Department for 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only told him there had been a shooting. But as soon as he arrived on the scene, a first responder pulled him aside and told him that it was actually a fatality. The victim was 33-year-old John Parker Jr. He had been identified by the other two witnesses who were still at the scene. The first responder also explained that before they spoke to any witnesses, they had tried to find John's wallet to identify him. But the wallet wasn't in any of his pockets, and it wasn't in the car. When Toth heard that, his first immediate thought was that this was probably a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a closer look at John, he immediately started to question that theory. John was lying on his back behind his parked car. And the first thing Toth noticed was that John was wearing a lot of very nice, very expensive jewelry. He had gold and diamond rings on his fingers, a heavy bracelet on his wrist, and a very expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was in a remote area. It wasn't close to anything. It just didn't seem like the kind of place where a random mugger would hang out hoping to find a victim. Toth started to wonder if maybe the killer took the wallet just to throw the police off, to make them think it was a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely a planned and efficient execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, which suggested he never saw it coming. And when Toth carefully used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw the gunshot wound. It was right behind his ear. Toth had actually worked as a paramedic before he became a detective, so he knew from experience that a shot like that had likely killed John instantly. It also meant that John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food on the ground and a set of car keys right next to John's body. The way they were placed on the pavement made it look like John had probably been holding them when he fell. If John had been in some kind of altercation, like a struggle with a thief or a fight that ended in murder, the scene would have been much messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had simply walked up to John while he was distracted at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then, after John was on the ground, grabbed his wallet and just left. This also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth and his team could find were 2 shell casings on the ground. He doubted they would find any useful footprints or any DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they had already done a sweep of the entire office park. They had looked in all the dumpsters, checked the bushes, and even looked on the roofs of the buildings. But they hadn't found anything. And there were no security cameras or surveillance systems anywhere in the area. So, as Toth stood there in the middle of the parking lot, watching his officers continue to search, he had a sinking realization. He was now the lead detective on a murder case with virtually no forensic evidence. That was a daunting position to be in, but he reminded himself that he did have at least 2 witnesses. About an hour later, Toth was sitting across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside an interrogation room at the Maryville police station. He'd learned a few basic things about Judy already. She was the one who had told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that as the spouse of a murder victim, she was automatically his #1 suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the one who had pulled the trigger. But given how clean the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a professional hit. And if that was the case, Judy could have been the one who hired the killer. But as Toth started to speak with Judy, he began to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying. It was making it hard for her to even get her words out. And when she did manage to speak, her voice was slow and quiet, like it was taking every ounce of her energy just to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth the timeline of the evening. She told him how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date night, and then they had stopped by the office afterward because one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been at the office, and that after she went back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were still talking inside. Then, at some point, John had left the building and come out to the car to get his dinner leftovers. She said at that time she had turned away from him for a moment, and that's when she heard the two loud shots. When she turned back around, she saw John fall. And then she saw the figure in dark clothes bending over John before they ran away. However, once Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something in her demeanor shifted. The shakiness in her voice, all the raw grief that had been pouring out of her, it just vanished. In its place, Judy became very stern, very hardened. She looked directly at Toth, right into his eyes, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw the sudden change, he almost got goosebumps. It was such a drastic departure from how she had been acting just moments before. And he thought to himself, either she is a fantastic actress and this is all just a big performance, meaning she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who is in shock and doesn't know how to process the fact that her husband has just been murdered in front of her. At some point during the interview, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anyone, absolutely anyone, who might have wanted to hurt John. Judy seemed to think about it for a second, but eventually she just shook her head and said, no. She said that John was an incredible husband and a wonderful father. She said they had a great marriage that they had both worked very hard on and that everyone at work respected him. But then, something seemed to click in her memory. She frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. She explained that after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John right there in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled former employee was definitely someone he needed to talk to. Toth was scheduled to speak with the office manager, Barry Jones, right after he was done with Judy. So he figured he could ask Barry about that incident as well. Now, Toth wasn't ready to completely rule Judy out as a suspect. He still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about the state of her marriage. But for now, he didn't see any reason to hold her. So he told Judy that she was free to go home and be with her kids, to grieve, and that they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting for him. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee that John Parker had recently fired. The night before, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones. Barry had confirmed what Judy had said about Derek. He verified that after Derek was fired, there had been a huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and that Derek was the one who had started it. It was really the only useful piece of information Barry had given him. Barry claimed that during the actual shooting, he had been in the bathroom, so he hadn't heard or seen anything at all until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was solid enough for now. And it wasn't just Barry and Judy who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before coming here, Toth had also spoken to John's brother David. David was incredibly devastated and absolutely furious about his brother's death. And David had also pointed the finger directly at Derek. So, Toth was very eager to meet this man, Derek, a man that 3 different people claimed could be a killer. Toth reached the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. When Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed completely stunned by the news of John's murder, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in his living room. And even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there. He said he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek explained that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he had ever expected. And when he couldn't keep up with the workload, he was fired. And then, to make matters worse, John had shorted him $400 on his final paycheck. So, he had gone back to J&J to get the money he felt he was owed. He admitted that it did lead to a physical confrontation, but he insisted they had only pushed each other a bit and that the whole thing had been resolved. He made it sound like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted that he could not have killed John because he had an alibi. He had spent the entire evening of the murder at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth his friend's phone number and said, "Go ahead, call him. He'll confirm everything." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he wrote down the number. But if this alibi checked out, he would have to rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was still possible that Derek had hired someone to kill John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem probable that he would have the kind of extra cash needed to pay a hitman. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back into his car, he decided the interview wasn't a total waste of time after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize something. He needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John had gotten rich very young and had built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, people who achieve that kind of rapid success often step on a few toes to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct, heading towards an interrogation room. He had already confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects. And that was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his original witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. The day before, Toth had gone back to the J&J Parker Industries office. He made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And what he found out was that, by all accounts, John was a great boss. He pushed his employees to be their best, but he worked just as hard, if not harder, himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company and that the Parkers, as a team, were very well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But there was also some office gossip. And this gossip said that their marriage was not as happy as it seemed. It was apparently common knowledge around the office that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even claimed they had caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned any of this the first time Toth had spoken to them. So now, Toth had no idea if anything they had told him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom. He could have been the shooter. Or maybe he and Judy were working together and they were both lying to cover their tracks. Toth was leaning towards the second option, because he had also found out that Judy was set to get a very big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And on top of that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe, Toth thought, she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth walked into the interrogation room, his plan was to basically tell Barry that the investigation was over, that they had caught him in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like a guilty man who had been cornered. He was charismatic and confident. He said the affair was just baseless office gossip. He claimed he was just good friends with Judy and that they worked together closely. Barry insisted that he, Judy, and John were like a family. In fact, he said he was currently living with one of Judy's cousins who was visiting from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe a word Barry was saying. But even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth had to let him go. Without any physical evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the word of the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that wasn't enough to prove they had conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk. He was rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before he approached Judy about it again. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything. And he didn't really have any other leads. He had learned that the shell casings found at the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. That was useful information to have, but it wasn't going to help him narrow down his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been working on this case non-stop since Thursday night, and he was completely exhausted. He was starting to think about maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his office door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was someone on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone. The person on the other end of the line explained that they were a police officer as well from a nearby town. They said they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information that might be relevant. It turned out that about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search of the kids' belongings and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was a payment for a hit on John Parker. That stunned Toth. But it wasn't nearly as shocking as what the officer said next. These 2 kids claimed that the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing. Daniel Hicks was John's own 5-year-old stepson. Toth had started to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it had never even occurred to him that the hit could be linked to John's own family, let alone a child. The officer on the phone explained that they hadn't taken the kid's claim very seriously at the time, so no one had ever notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Toth didn't have to say it, but this was a massive screw-up on their part. But he wasn't focused on placing blame. He was focused on figuring out what had happened. So, Toth got the names of the 2 kids with the cash from the officer. As soon as he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track those kids down. Then, Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son Daniel in for an interview. And since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come with him. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting in a chair at the back of the room watching. Her son, Daniel, was sitting at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy briefly right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her son had apparently asked someone to kill John. She told Toth there had to be some kind of mistake, and she was happy for the police to speak to Daniel directly because she was sure that would clear this whole mess up. Toth had made a strategic decision not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment. She was being very cooperative by letting them speak to her son, and he didn't want to upset her and risk her changing her mind. They also hadn't been able to locate the 2 kids that Daniel had supposedly hired yet, so right now, Daniel was the only one he could question. And now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He looked nervous. He was blinking a lot, and he kept wringing his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. So, Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So, right off the bat, he told Daniel that he knew about the murder-for-hire plot, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a deep breath and then said it was true. He admitted that he had paid 2 of his friends some money he had saved up from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. He said John was always on his case, always yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel insisted that he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to teach John a lesson, to beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth, and that the 2 kids in the detention center had either lied about the murder part or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched. Why would these kids lie and get themselves into even more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying. And Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So, he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then, Toth called some officers into the room to make the arrest. As he left, he could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked and protesting behind him. At this point, even though Toth had been up all night and was completely exhausted, he actually felt more alert than he had in days. It finally felt like they were making real progress on this case. So, instead of going home to get some rest, he went back to his office, poured himself a cup of coffee, and kept on working. On the 15th of May, 2003, almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk. He was reading over the copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that the police were looking for information about John Parker's murder, and it offered a reward to anyone who came forward with a tip. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town the next day, hoping the public could give him a new lead. It was kind of a desperate move, because while this case had seemed so close to being solved just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead in the water. It had taken the police a while, but they had finally located both of the kids from the detention center, the ones Daniel had supposedly hired. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and taking his money. But it turned out there was just no way they were the actual murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas on the night John was killed, and the other had been locked up in a juvenile detention facility. So, since Toth couldn't prove that the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent. Those two kids had insisted that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that part. And Toth didn't think that someone who wanted to kill his father had just suddenly changed his mind. But since Toth knew that Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings at the exact time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely just gotten somebody else to do it for him. But Toth couldn't just keep questioning Daniel. Judy had hired a lawyer, and they were now refusing to let Toth question any of the family members at all. And that was incredibly frustrating because Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone involved, she benefited the most from John's death. She was the beneficiary on his life insurance, and she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry. So maybe part of her motive was just to hide the affair from him. And then there was Barry. He was potentially having this affair with John's wife. He might have had his own motive to get rid of John to keep the affair a secret. He also definitely seemed to think that John was a pretty tough boss, so maybe he'd just had enough and was either complicit or actively involved in the murder. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's story about being in the bathroom. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired someone to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool of suspects. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because, as of this week, he was also considering John's own brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because David had stopped by and gotten into a huge verbal fight with the family. And this wasn't the first time it had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could just mean that David was lashing out because he was grieving the loss of his brother. But it could also mean that he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet. He knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have easily guessed that John, being the workaholic he was, would check in at the office after they were done eating. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at the flyer. His brain was fried. But he felt hopeful. He thought these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to finally break this case. And so, the next day, Toth and some other officers passed out the flyers all over town. But then, weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual usable evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over the case files again and again, looking for something he might have missed, maybe a witness they didn't interview, or a piece of evidence they had overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn his attention to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. 4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. He had never forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was no longer actively investigating it. In fact, all of his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him in the hallway and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations. And they had realized that this man had some crossover with one of Toth's old homicide cases from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped dead in his tracks. He immediately told the officer to go get that man into an interview room. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man. He was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker. And this person had admitted to him that they were directly involved in John's death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair, feeling both a wave of relief and a deep sense of disturbance. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was. And he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of the 17th of April, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance with Judy sitting inside of it, but she was not the killer's target. John was also near the car. He wasn't inside it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. The door was open, and he was rifling around inside the car looking for something. As the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were about to do, they thought about who this man was, how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell, and now the killer was going to get their revenge. So, while John's back was still turned, the killer silently walked right up behind him. They raised the gun, aimed it at the back of his head, and they fired. It was a direct hit, right behind the ear. John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, the bullet just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were jostled back to reality when they heard John's wife Judy yelling and screaming from inside the car. So, as quickly as they could, the killer grabbed John's wallet to make the police think this was a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived. This person gave the killer a hug and told them they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer had worn during the murder and told the killer they were going to dispose of all of it. And the killer just listened, feeling a sense of relief. They trusted this mastermind more than anyone else in the entire world. Because after all, she was his mother. It would turn out that Judy had convinced her own 5-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. With his death, she could get the whole thing. It turned out she had already tried to kill John before, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him. When that didn't work, she had tried to hire a hitman herself. But that also failed. So, finally, she asked Daniel to help, promising him that he would get some of the money. She had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun that was used to kill John. Daniel had actually tried to hire someone else for the job first, but then ultimately decided to do it himself. He used his younger siblings as an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting them all night. And the man who told all of this to the police was Christina's husband, who she had married 2 years after John's death. Once her husband gave the authorities the entire story, the police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed to everything. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison. Daniel got 23 years in prison for pulling the trigger. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. In a tragic end to an already devastating story, Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released from prison in 2017, and his mother Judy was released in 2022. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was a little after 1 in the afternoon on the 18th of May, 2007, when a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a large park in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She was on her way to meet a friend, and his house was located right in the middle of this park, so she had to walk through it to get there. This was a daily ritual for Yvonne. Nearly every single day, she would make this same walk to go and spend time with her friend. Usually, on a weekday afternoon, the park was pretty quiet. There might be a few people strolling along the paths, but for the most part, it was a calm and peaceful walk. But on this particular day, the park was absolutely packed with people. It was the Friday, kicking off a long holiday weekend, and the weather was beautiful and sunny. It seemed like everyone in the city had the same idea to come out and enjoy the spring air. Families were everywhere, the playground was overflowing with kids, and the park's little cafe had a line out the door. Yvonne, however, wasn't really paying much attention to the crowds around her. Her mind was focused entirely on her friend. They had known each other for years, and in her heart, she felt they shared a very special connection, the kind of bond she didn't really have with anyone else in her life. Now, Yvonne was well aware that many people, including some of her own family and friends, didn't quite see it that way. They thought the relationship was less special and more strange. Some had even told her directly that they disapproved of it, and she could understand why they might feel that way, at least on the surface. Yvonne was a very friendly, social, and outgoing person. She loved to chat and be around people. Her friend, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was extremely reclusive and almost never left his house. To an outsider, they seemed like a very odd pair. There were other things, too. Her friend was originally from Germany, and even though he had been living in the Netherlands for many years, he had never learned to speak Dutch. This meant he couldn't really communicate with anyone, and that included Yvonne, at least not with words. But for Yvonne, none of that mattered. In fact, the disapproval from others only made her feel more protective of him. She felt like people just didn't understand. She was also deeply sympathetic to his past. She knew that her friend had been abandoned by his mother when he was just a child, and this fact always tugged at her heart. In a way, she saw herself as a sort of maternal figure in his life, stepping in to offer the care and companionship he had been denied. And so, as she continued her walk, her thoughts filled with warmth for her friend, she rounded a final corner on the path. Up ahead, she could see his house. As she got closer, she could see him through one of the front windows. He didn't look happy at all. He looked downcast, almost dejected, and seeing him like that made her want to cheer him up even more. So she put on her biggest, warmest smile. She started waving enthusiastically as she approached his house, trying to catch his eye. And sure enough, after a moment, he turned his head, looked out the window, and saw her. His entire demeanor changed. He broke into a big smile and began to wave back at her. For Yvonne, this was everything. It was proof of their connection. Even without a shared language, they understood each other. Seeing his smile filled her with a pure sense of happiness. She felt so glad that she was there for him. She walked the rest of the way to his house and went to see him. That day was spent much like all their other days together. Because they couldn't talk, their time was filled with simple gestures and quiet companionship. They would just sit together, enjoying each other's presence. It was a unique relationship, but for Yvonne, it was more than enough. She truly believed he felt the same way, that he valued their time together just as much as she did. But as much as she cherished these visits, she couldn't stay all day. She had her own family and responsibilities to get back to. So, at around 2:30 inches the afternoon, after spending about an hour with him, she said her goodbyes. She turned to leave, knowing that she would be back again soon, probably the very next day. Yvonne walked away from her friend's house and had only taken a few steps down the path when two different things happened at almost the exact same time. First, she noticed a group of young kids off to the side, and they were throwing rocks. It was just a small detail, but her mind registered it. It was the kind of thing that you see and instinctively know shouldn't be happening in a public park. She didn't think much more of it, but she was aware of it. The second thing she noticed was a sound. It was the sound of splashing coming from somewhere behind her. This seemed odd. It hadn't rained recently, so there were no puddles on the path. The only source of water nearby was a small stream that ran through the park, but it was in an area that was off-limits to visitors. There was no reason anyone should be in there. But the splashing sound was unmistakable. Yvonne wasn't alarmed by any of this, just curious. Her mind was simply processing these little details from her surroundings. And so, she found herself turning around, mostly to see what could possibly be making that splashing noise. As she turned, something enormous and powerful slammed into her. It hit her with such force that she was knocked to the ground and pinned there. All around her, the park erupted in screams. The last conscious thought that flashed through her mind before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not too far away, a man named Arved Hendris was also at the park with his wife and their 2 young children. They were standing right outside that little cafe that Yvonne had been walking near. Arved had just been about to go inside to buy some drinks when the commotion started. He heard the same screams that had filled Yvonne's final moments of consciousness. The cafe was a small place, really more of a glorified snack bar than a restaurant. It sat on a main pathway that cut through the park and had a large pavilion out front with tables and chairs. From where Arved was standing on that pavilion, he could hear the screaming getting louder, and then he saw people. Dozens of people were running directly towards him. But Arved had absolutely no idea what was happening. He couldn't see what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It was just pure sudden panic. Instinct took over. Before he even knew what the threat was, his first thought was to protect his family. He grabbed his kids and his wife and ran into the cafe along with the rest of the terrified crowd. The inside of the cafe felt a bit like a small dining hall, with large communal tables filling the space. It wasn't built to hold this many people at once. As everyone rushed inside, the room quickly descended into chaos. A few people had the presence of mind to try and barricade the entrance. The front door brothers were made of glass and wouldn't offer much protection, but they did their best, shoving tables and chairs against them to block whatever was outside. After this initial rush, a strange and tense calm fell over the room. The air was still buzzing with fear, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Arved, like most of the other people crammed inside, was still completely in the dark. They had all just reacted to the panic of the crowd, assuming there must have been a very real danger outside. Now, in this weird lull, everyone was looking around at each other, wondering what was going on. Were they safe now? Or had they overreacted? As they all stood there in suspense, the glass of the front doors suddenly shattered. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through the cafe. The room was plunged back into absolute chaos. Parents were grabbing their children, screaming, and now everyone was trying to get out. The place that had seemed like a safe shelter moments before now felt like a trap. A huge bottleneck formed at the shattered doors as dozens of people tried to squeeze through at once. It was just a frantic crush of bodies. Arved looked at the mob of people and knew there was no way he could get his family through that safely. So he made a different choice. He grabbed his wife and his kids, and he pulled them under one of the large, heavy tables to hide. For the next couple of minutes, the sounds of madness continued all around them. People were screaming, crying, and scrambling to get out of the cafe. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it all went quiet. Everyone else had made it out. It was just Arved and his family huddled together under the table, listening to the silence. For a brief moment, Arved felt a sense of relief. He thought, whatever it was, it's over. We're safe. But just before he told his family it was okay to come out, he heard another sound. It was the sound of more glass breaking. And then he heard loud, heavy, stomping sounds. Something huge was making its way through the broken front doors and into the cafe. Arved peered out from under the table, and in that moment, when he saw what had entered the cafe, he finally understood why everyone had been running. He also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out that all the people in Yvonne's life who had frowned upon her special friendship had been right to be concerned. Because although Yvonne loved her friend and their daily routine, her friend did not feel the same way at all. Every day, when Yvonne would visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company, and she would smile at him. And in her mind, when her friend smiled back, it was a sign of their mutual affection. It was the foundation of their bond. What Yvonne never knew was that her friend absolutely hated it. For him, her smile was not a friendly gesture. On that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park surrounding his home was far more crowded and noisy than usual. And those kids that Yvonne had briefly noticed, the ones throwing rocks, they had been doing it for a while. Some of those rocks had been hitting his house, and the repeated thuds were making him more and more agitated. And then, through all of this, Yvonne had been there, smiling at him over and over again. She thought she was being comforting, but her actions were just adding fuel to the fire. Her constant smiling sent him right over the edge. So, when Yvonne finally got up and walked away, you might think her friend would have felt a sense of relief. One of the sources of his agitation was finally gone. But he knew she wasn't leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow and the day after that, like she always did, with that same infuriating smile. He just couldn't take it anymore. So, he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limit stream to get across the park to where Yvonne was walking away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at her before she could smile at him. And for the very first time, she didn't smile back. Instead, her face was filled with terror. And that was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Bocato. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, baring your teeth in what humans call a smile is not a sign of friendship. It is a sign of aggression, a threat, a display of hostility. So, from Bocato's point of view, it's very likely that for years, almost every single day, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure to threaten him. And when he smiled back, showing his own teeth, he was threatening her right back, hoping she would finally get the message and leave him alone. But it never worked. She always came back. Eventually, it all just became too much for him to handle. Luckily, despite the rampage, Bocato didn't seriously harm anyone else. He bit Yvonne over 100 times and broke multiple of her bones, but somehow she did survive the attack. No other zoo guests were injured, including Arved and his family. They were trapped in that cafe while Bocato walked around inside, but for whatever reason, the gorilla never attacked them. After some time, Arved and his family were able to make a run for it and get to safety. After she had recovered from her injuries, Yvonne spoke to the media. She told them that Bocato was still her darling. That's the word she used. And incredibly, she would eventually go back to the zoo to see him again. But this time, she didn't smile. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th of August, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ally Dogan was sitting in the very front seat of a passenger bus as it traveled down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ally and the 50 or so other passengers were making the journey from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, the largest city in the country. They were about 3 hours into what was supposed to be a 5-hour trip. To pass the time, Ally had been talking quietly with the man sitting next to him. The man was a lieutenant in the Air Force. The lieutenant told Ally that he wasn't even supposed to be on this bus. Originally, he had a plane ticket to fly to Istanbul, but he had missed his flight. And so, here he was. But the lieutenant wasn't upset about it. He told Ally that he was actually really enjoying the bus ride. He had never been on a long-distance bus trip before, and he thought it was a neat experience. Most importantly, he had managed to get a seat in the very front row, right behind the huge front window of the bus. He said he found it exhilarating to be able to see the road rushing towards them in the dark. Ally felt the exact same way. In fact, when he had first boarded the bus, someone else had been sitting in his seat next to the lieutenant. Ally had specifically asked that passenger if they would be willing to switch spots with him because he wanted that incredible view too. So he and the lieutenant had quickly bonded over their shared excitement for their front row seats. They spoke in hushed voices because nearly everyone else on the bus was fast asleep around them. But these two were wide awake, wired with the simple thrill of watching the road unfold before them. But after a while, despite his enthusiasm, Ali started to feel drowsy. He was on his way back to Istanbul for college, and later that day, he had a very important exam. As much as he wanted to stay up all night and enjoy the ride, he knew he really needed to get some sleep if he was going to do well on his test. So he took off his sweatshirt, rolled it up into a makeshift pillow, and placed it behind his head. He told the lieutenant he was going to try and get some rest, then he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. About 15 minutes passed, and Ally was just beginning to drift into a real sleep, when the bus was suddenly filled with the sound of screams. Ally's eyes snapped open. He looked straight ahead out the front windshield and saw a pair of bright headlights barreling down on them. They were in the wrong lane, or another vehicle was in their lane. It didn't matter. He knew in that instant that they were about to have a head-on collision. Then, the bus driver wrenched the wheel, and the bus swerved hard to the right. Ally grabbed onto the partition in front of him to keep from being thrown out of his seat. He braced himself for the impact he knew was coming. But at the very last second, instead of smashing into the other vehicle, the bus veered completely off the road. It went crashing down into a deep ditch that ran alongside the road. The bus lurched violently before the driver managed to slam on the brakes and bring it to a stop. For a second, there was silence. Ally looked around. Everyone was shaken up, but it seemed they were okay. He felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. They had avoided what would have been a catastrophic crash. But that feeling of relief didn't last long. Ally quickly realized they had a new and very serious problem. The bus was starting to fill with thick smoke. Because they were sitting at the very front, Ally and the lieutenant were the closest to the main door. It was clear that they needed to evacuate immediately. It looked like the crash had started some kind of fire. The two men stood up. The bus was tilted at a strange angle from where it had landed in the ditch. They made their way to the front and looked out through the now cracked front windshield. Out in the darkness, they could see a huge truck that was also in the ditch just ahead of them. That must have been the vehicle they had nearly hit. It seemed they had collided with it after all, just not head-on. It was a dangerous situation. There was clearly a fire somewhere, and they had to get everyone off the bus as fast as possible. Ally and the lieutenant got to the door and tried to open it, but the frame of the bus had been warped in the crash, and the door was jammed shut. The lieutenant got down and started smashing his body against the door, trying to force it open. As he did this, the smoke inside the bus was getting thicker and darker. The other passengers were starting to panic. They were all rushing towards the front, crowding around Ally and the lieutenant, desperate to get out. Finally, with a loud groan of metal, the lieutenant managed to force the door open. The second it opened, an even bigger plume of black smoke poured into the bus from outside. You could barely see a thing. Everyone was choking and screaming. The lieutenant just yelled at Ally to go, to get out right now. And so Ally was the first person off the bus. He scrambled down the steps into a wall of smoke. He had no idea where the fire was actually coming from. It was just smoke everywhere. Acting on pure instinct, he just jumped. He leaped as high and as far away from the bus as he possibly could. He landed on the far side of the ditch. He stumbled but managed to climb up the other side of the embankment, putting distance between himself and the bus. As soon as he was clear, he turned around and looked back. It was the middle of the night, but even in the darkness, he could see the bus was completely swallowed by that thick, dark smoke. He still couldn't see any flames, but he figured the engine must have caught fire and it was spreading underneath the bus. He could hear the people still on board, desperately trying to get out through the single door that the lieutenant had opened. But there seemed to be a bottleneck. They weren't getting out fast enough. People were screaming in panic, and then Allie heard the sound of windows being pushed open. People were so desperate that they were starting to jump out of the windows to escape. At first, the screams Allie heard sounded like fear, the desperate cries of people trying to evacuate a burning vehicle. But very quickly, as more people started coming out of the bus, the sound of their screams changed. They turned into screams of pure, unimaginable agony. As Allie listened to this horror unfold, he tried to make sense of it. He thought, okay, maybe they're catching on fire as they jump out. Or maybe they're breaking bones when they land in the ditch. It was all terrible, but at least they were getting out of the bus. He was sure that any second they would climb up the other side of the ditch and join him where he stood. He saw them coming out. He heard them, but no one came. The screams of agony just got louder and louder, and nobody climbed out of that ditch. Allie was still all alone, and he had no idea why. All he could see was smoke, and all he could hear were those terrible screams. Then, authorities began to arrive at the scene. He watched as they rushed into the smoke, trying to fight whatever fire was there and rescue the people trapped inside. But despite this huge emergency response happening right in front of him, nobody, not even the lieutenant who had saved him, ever came over the ditch to where he was. He was completely alone. After some time, Allie noticed a few of the emergency workers walking away from the bus, away from the smoke. They were carrying what looked like bodies. But as he stared, a cold dread filled him. They weren't carrying whole bodies. They were carrying body parts. It would turn out that many of the initial assumptions were correct. The bus had swerved to avoid an oncoming vehicle. It had struck the big truck that Allie and the lieutenant saw in the ditch. It wasn't a head-on impact, but more of a glancing blow. That collision was enough to send both vehicles off the road and into the ditch. And the crash is what caused all the smoke. But everyone, including Allie, had been completely wrong about what was causing that smoke. There was no fire at all. The truck that the bus had hit was a shipping truck. It was transporting a huge cargo of freight to Istanbul. When the two vehicles collided, the truck's shipping containers were ruptured and the entire contents of those containers poured out into the ditch. The ditch, where the bus had crashed, already had a significant amount of standing water in it from recent rains. When the freight from the truck mixed with the water, it triggered a powerful chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is what produced the thick, choking clouds of smoke. The freight being transported in that truck was nitric acid. It's a highly corrosive and extremely toxic liquid chemical. Now, that entire ditch, which was filled with water, had become a massive smoking acid bath. And so all of those desperate passengers, thinking they were escaping a fire, were leaping out of the bus and landing directly in the ditch. They were landing in a pool of diluted but still incredibly powerful acid, and they were being dissolved by it. Allie had survived for one simple reason. When he was the first one to get off the bus, he thought he was jumping away from a fire at the base of the vehicle. So he took a huge leap, trying to clear the flames he imagined were there. In doing so, without realizing it, he had jumped completely over the acid bath and landed safely on the other side. But virtually everyone who came after him went straight into the acid. In the end, of the nearly 50 people who had been on that bus, 26 of them dissolved to death in that ditch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One night in December of 2009, a man was digging through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died. And so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one up and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up because the notebooks were actually diaries. They were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. On the night of the 24th of July, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas. She was there with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. The three of them were just standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay or if they should just leave. As they stood there, they could hear people having fun on all the rides. There were kids laughing and screaming. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen to come here. This was supposed to be their fun activity for the evening. But so far, the night really had not been that great. Susan's best friend, a woman named Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, a man named Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them to this fair because Susan's life, of late, had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of a very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she had been dating had wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyway, were in pretty rough shape. Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and, for at least one night, just come enjoy this fair. Forget about everything else and just have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around, playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at a fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that she wasn't really having a good time. She said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she just couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio was standing at the gate, wondering if it was even worth staying any longer. Ultimately, Roy finally just said, "You know what? Why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too." He suggested they could go back to Stephenville and just drive around for a bit, and eventually they could go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and get some ice cream. When Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought it was a great idea. And so they left. They hopped in Roy's truck and began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that feeling that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away. And so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having a great night, the first one in a long time. It felt like the last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February. He had taken her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected. And he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce. And then, instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory where she worked in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex, and with all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped her pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. She had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so, slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. And she just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life is turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table and, without saying anything, she walked up to the counter and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. When she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like she had been set free. She was just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked. And then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry. She had made the bed and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over at her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also, she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy. And Susan by this point believed she had found almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet and then go to bed because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. 2 days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days and nobody could get a hold of her, and so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said, no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name, but he didn't get a response. So, he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something was wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. His daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then it's like he broke out of his fog. He stumbled backwards. He ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter. And based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then, after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands. And then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume. And so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable, except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress. And also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. This had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So, after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages, but he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died. Although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a doorframe to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case. So everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. Not only because he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work. So there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. 2 days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help scanning the mourners through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large-framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing. And Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis. And word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. Which meant that as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet. And Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands, and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then, one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so, without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, "Sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work." Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file. And then, after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory. And so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee. And then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer. And she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so, realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bowman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C.'s story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said, yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bowman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay. But J.C. got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of J.C. So he decided to push pretty early and see how J.C. reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first, but he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints," and he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog. So his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan, and Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut. So he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, and Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time, in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, "Well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints, like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd match the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect. Or, more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed. That's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally... Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime. So Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then, one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out. And at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement because, through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspects' fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table. And as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend J.C. Bowman, her best friend's boyfriend Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael. Because Michael is this enraged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. he drank Coke, and he smoked cigarettes just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons & Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these three men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion and finally just total disbelief because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father, Joe, his friend, some closure, but now he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes. He studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone. And he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown print against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print. So, the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here. But he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, 1987. Stephenville's main street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts. And as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So, the killer stayed half-drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so, they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram. And then the killer stripped off their clothes. They stretched out on the floor and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then. But now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road, and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door, and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile, and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her, but Susan immediately pulled back. Suddenly angry, the killer grabbed her and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years. But that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark. And he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley. And just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the roundtable. And Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason, pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so, on the 7th of June 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons. And Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.